For over 4 decades, he was a ghost, a phantom who haunted the suburbs of California, leaving a trail of terror that stretched from Sacramento to Orange County. He was known by many names, each tied to a different region's nightmare: the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. He was responsible for at least 13 fatal assaults, more than 50 sexual assaults, and over 120 home invasions. Then, for decades, he vanished, leaving one of America's most terrifying cold cases frozen in time. Law enforcement hit dead end after dead end. But while the official investigation stalled, a new one was just beginning, not in a police station, but in the digital ether. This is the story of how a dedicated community of online sleuths, a brilliant true crime writer, and a revolutionary new DNA technique finally unmasked a monster. Welcome to Vanishing Threads. Today we explore the story of the man who would become known as the Golden State Killer. In the early 1970s, the quiet agricultural town of Visalia, California, was plagued by a prolific cat burglar. Dubbed the Visalia Ransacker, this intruder was unnervingly bold. He would break into homes, not always to steal valuables, but to rifle through personal belongings, moving items, and creating a profound sense of violation. The spree culminated in the fatal assault of journalism professor Claude Snelling, who was shot and killed while trying to stop the ransacker from abducting his daughter. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, the ransacker was gone. 2 years later, in 1976, a new reign of terror began 200 miles north in the suburbs of Sacramento. This attacker, named the East Area Rapist, or EAR, was different. He was a predator. His methods were chillingly meticulous. He would stalk his victims, initially single women, then couples, for weeks, learning their routines, their homes, even the names of their family members from photos on the wall. He would break in at night, rouse the victims from their sleep with a flashlight beam to the eyes, and subject them to hours of psychological and physical torture. He would bind the male victims, place dishes on their backs, and threaten to kill them both if he heard the plates rattle. He would then ransack the house, eating food from their refrigerators and taking small sentimental items as trophies. Between 1976 and 1979, he committed over 50 sexual assaults in Northern California. The fear was palpable. Gun sales soared, and communities were paralyzed. Then the assaults in Northern California stopped. The case went cold, but the monster had just moved south. From 1979 to 1986, a series of brutal assaults occurred in Southern California, from Santa Barbara to Orange County. This killer, dubbed the original Night Stalker, or ONS, targeted couples. His methods were identical to the East Area Rapist, but now he was killing. The last known fatal assault occurred in 1986. After that, silence. For 30 years, the trail went completely cold. For decades, these were treated as separate cases. The Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, 3 different phantoms. It wasn't until the early 2000s, with the advent of DNA analysis, that law enforcement definitively linked the EAR and ONS cases. They were the work of one man, but his identity remained a mystery. As the official investigation languished, a new type of detective agency was forming in the nascent world of the internet. On message boards like the A&E Cold Case Files Forum and later dedicated websites, a community of citizen sleuths began to congregate. These were not trained investigators. They were ordinary people with an extraordinary passion for justice. They were retired cops, amateur genealogists, data analysts, and people who had grown up in the shadow of the killer's terror. They meticulously digitized case files, created spreadsheets of attack details, and used satellite imagery to map crime scenes. They debated theories, connected disparate pieces of evidence, and built a massive, crowdsourced database of knowledge that, in some ways, surpassed the siloed information held by different police jurisdictions. This digital echo chamber kept the case alive, refusing to let the victims be forgotten. Into this world stepped Michelle McNamara. A writer with a fascination for unsolved mysteries, McNamara started a blog in 2006 called True Crime Diary. She wasn't just a casual blogger, she was a tenacious investigative journalist. She became obsessed with the EAR-ONS case, finding it unacceptable that a killer of this magnitude could simply disappear. It was McNamara who, frustrated by the clumsy acronyms, coined the name that would become infamous, the Golden State Killer. It was a name that captured the statewide nature of his crimes and gave a single, terrifying identity to the monster. McNamara spent thousands of hours on the case. She dug through dusty boxes of police reports, interviewed detectives and victims, and built a network of fellow sleuths online. She saw the internet not just as a place for discussion, but as a tool. She used it to connect with people, to find information, and to weave together a narrative from decades of cold, hard facts. Michelle McNamara's work was more than a hobby. It was a crusade. She was determined to write a book that would not only tell the story of the crimes, but also, she hoped, help solve them. She envisioned a final chapter where the killer was identified. Her blog and later the subreddit /EARONS became the epicenters of the online investigation, drawing in new generations of sleuths who were captivated by her writing and dedication. But the case took a personal toll. In her book, she wrote, "There's a scream inside that wants to get out. It's the presence of the unfinished, the unresolved, the unknown." She suffered from anxiety and insomnia, the darkness of the case seeping into her own life. Tragically, on April 21, 2016, Michelle McNamara died in her sleep from an accidental overdose of prescription medication combined with an undiagnosed heart condition. She was 46 years old. Her book was unfinished. It seemed the scream would remain inside. But her work was not in vain. Her husband, the actor Patton Oswalt, along with her lead researcher and a fellow journalist, were determined to finish her life's work. In 2018, I'll Be Gone in the Dark was published. It was an instant masterpiece, a haunting and brilliant exploration of a cold case and the obsession it takes to solve one. The book shot to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, bringing unprecedented global attention to the hunt for the Golden State Killer. It lit a fire under law enforcement and inspired a new wave of public interest. Michelle McNamara had laid the groundwork, and now the final act was about to begin. One of the people most affected by McNamara's work was Paul Holes, a cold case investigator for the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office. Holes had been hunting the Golden State Killer for over 2 decades. He was one of the few who had stayed on the case, even as it was passed down through generations of detectives. The renewed attention from McNamara's book gave him the push he needed to try something radical. The killer's DNA had been preserved from a 1980 crime scene, but it had never matched anyone in the National Criminal Database. The trail was cold, but a new technique was emerging: investigative genetic genealogy. The process involved uploading a crime scene DNA profile to public, open-source genealogy websites like GEDmatch, where individuals voluntarily upload their own DNA data to find relatives. In 2017, Holes, working with FBI scientist Steve Kramer, uploaded the killer's DNA. They weren't looking for the killer himself, but for a distant relative, a third, fourth, or even fifth cousin. They got a hit. The killer shared DNA with a handful of users on the site, indicating they all shared a common ancestor from the 19th century. This is where the real digital sleuthing began. Holes enlisted the help of a brilliant and retired patent attorney turned genealogist, Dr. Barbara Ray Venter. For months, Ray Venter worked backward from the distant cousins, building out a massive family tree using census records, newspaper archives, and online obituaries. It was a monumental task, involving thousands of names. Then they began building the tree forward, tracing the descendants of that common ancestor down through the generations. After months of painstaking work, they narrowed the search to a handful of men in the right age range who could have been in the locations of the crimes. One name stood out: Joseph James D'Angelo, a 72-year-old former police officer living in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento, the heart of the East Area Rapists' hunting ground. The team was close, but they needed a direct DNA sample to be sure. Investigators began intense surveillance on D'Angelo. They watched his house, followed his car. The first break came when they collected a DNA sample from the door handle of his car. It was a partial match, not enough for an arrest, but enough to know they were on the right track. Days later, they got their final piece of evidence. They watched D'Angelo go to a Hobby Lobby, and after he left, they retrieved a tissue he had thrown into a trash can outside. The tissue was sent to the lab. The results came back, a perfect match to the DNA of the Golden State Killer. On April 24, 2018, almost exactly 2 years after Michelle McNamara's death, Paul Holes and a team of officers descended on Joseph James D'Angelo's home. The ghost who had haunted California for 40 years was finally caught. News of his arrest sent shockwaves around the world. In August 2020, D'Angelo was confronted by his surviving victims and their families in a 4-day sentencing hearing. One by one, they stood up and spoke of the lives he had shattered. Gay and Bob Hardwick, survivors of a 1978 attack, spoke of the lingering trauma. Chris Pedretti, who was 15 when she was assaulted, looked at him and said, "The devil can't hide forever." He sat silently in a wheelchair, never looking at them. Joseph James D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and 13 sexual assault-related charges to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. He will die in prison. The identification of the Golden State Killer was a watershed moment. It was the culmination of decades of traditional police work, the relentless passion of a citizen journalist, the collective power of online communities, and a groundbreaking scientific technique that has since solved hundreds of other cold cases. It proved that even the coldest of cases can be solved when the past is re-examined with the tools of the future, and that sometimes the ghosts that haunt us can finally be brought into the light. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, stay curious, stay safe.